Family drama is one of those things you never think will happen to you, until it does. Growing up, I always thought my family was solid. We were that typical suburban crew. My dad, John, was the hard-working breadwinner. My mom, Lisa, was the kind-hearted but overly protective matriarch. And then there was my older sister, Gemma, who I was once really close to. But all of that came crashing down over a single accusation that turned my entire life upside down. It all started on a chilly autumn evening 3 years ago. I had just gotten home from work when Gemma burst into the living room in a frenzy. She was crying, her face flushed, and she was clutching her left hand as if it was on fire. I had no idea what was going on, but it didn't take long before she dropped the bombshell. Her engagement ring was missing, and not just any ring. This was a family heirloom, a vintage diamond piece passed down through generations. It was supposed to be her something old for the wedding, which was just a few months away. Gemma was always dramatic, but this time it was different. She was convinced that someone had stolen it, and for some reason all eyes turned to me. At first, I laughed it off, thinking it was some kind of sick joke. But when my parents walked in and saw the scene, their faces turned grave. That's when I realized this wasn't a joke. Gemma pointed her finger at me. Her eyes filled with a mix of anger and betrayal. "I know you took it, Elliot," she screamed. "You've always been jealous of me. Admit it, you just wanted to sell it for cash." I was stunned. Jealous? Of what? Gemma and I were close growing up, but as adults we drifted apart. She went off to the big city, climbing the corporate ladder and living a life of luxury, while I stayed in our hometown, content with a simpler life. Sure, we had our differences, but jealousy? That was a stretch even for her. "Gemma, are you serious? Why would I steal your ring?" I retorted, trying to keep my voice steady, but my hands were shaking. The tension in the room was suffocating. But Gemma was relentless, and before I knew it, my parents were on her side. My dad, with his usual stern expression, demanded that I empty my pockets. My mom was already in tears, muttering something about how I was always the troubled one. The next thing I knew, they were tearing apart my room, searching through my drawers, my closet, even under my mattress. And to my horror, they found a stash of cash I had been saving up for a rainy day. It wasn't much, just a few $100s, but to them it was proof that I had pawned the ring. "Where did this come from, Elliot?" my dad barked, waving the crumpled bills in my face. "You've been struggling for money for months, and now suddenly you have all this cash? What are we supposed to think?" My heart was pounding in my chest. I tried to explain that it was just savings from odd jobs and birthday gifts, but they wouldn't hear it. Gemma, still crying, kept insisting I was lying. The worst part was seeing the disappointment in my mom's eyes. I thought she would believe me, but instead, she just kept shaking her head, whispering, "How could you do this?" I don't know what was worse, the accusations or the fact that my own family was so quick to believe the worst in me. By the end of the night, they had made up their minds. My dad told me to pack my things and leave. "We can't trust you under our roof," he said coldly, and just like that, I was out on the streets with nothing but a duffel bag and a broken heart. I crashed on a friend's couch that night, too stunned to even process what had happened. The next morning, I woke up hoping it had all been a bad dream, but the reality hit me hard when I checked my phone. No missed calls, no texts. My family had cut me off completely. Over the next few weeks, I tried to get in touch with them, hoping they'd come to their senses. I called, I texted, I even showed up at their door, but they wouldn't even let me in. Gemma had convinced them I was guilty, and that was the end of it. I was officially disowned. Those first few months were brutal. I bounced between friends' places, staying just long enough not to overstay my welcome, but always moving on before I became a burden. I picked up whatever odd jobs I could find, washing dishes, stocking shelves, even cleaning up after drunk college kids at the local bar. It was humiliating, but I was too proud to ask for help. Besides, I had no one left to ask. I remember one night, sitting in a dingy basement apartment that smelled like mold and regret, wondering how my life had turned into such a mess. I had gone from being part of a loving family to being completely alone in a matter of hours, all because of a ring I didn't even touch. Little did I know, the nightmare was far from over. It would take 3 years before the truth came out, and when it did, it would turn my world upside down all over again. Getting kicked out of my family home felt like I had been exiled to some far-off, unforgiving land. My phone stayed silent for days, no calls, no texts, no apologies from my family. It was like I had been erased from their lives. The people I had once thought would stand by me no matter what had turned their backs on me in a single night. I was too proud to beg for forgiveness for something I didn't do, and too hurt to try and fix things with people who believed I was a thief. So, I focused on survival. For the first few months, I lived out of a single duffel bag, hopping from one friend's couch to another. I was lucky that my friends had my back, but even then, there were only so many favors I could ask. After a while, I started to notice the sympathetic looks and awkward silences whenever I mentioned needing a place to crash for just a few more days. Finding work was another challenge. I didn't have a college degree, just some half-finished classes I had taken sporadically, thinking I had all the time in the world to figure things out. Now, I was a 26-year-old with no real career, no home, and a reputation that was trashed within my family circle. So, I picked up whatever odd jobs I could. Everything from bussing tables at the local diner to stacking boxes at a dusty warehouse on the edge of town. I didn't have the luxury to be picky. There was one particularly dark period when I found myself sleeping in my car, which was falling apart faster than my life was. It was the dead of winter, and I had to keep the engine running just to stay warm at night. I'll never forget those freezing nights, huddled under a pile of old blankets, praying that I wouldn't run out of gas before morning. But even in those bleak times, I was determined not to let my family's betrayal break me. Every time I felt like giving up, I'd think back to the look in Gemma's eyes when she accused me of stealing. It was as if all the love we shared as siblings had been erased in that one moment. That thought fueled me, kept me going even when things seemed hopeless. Slowly but surely, I started to piece my life back together. I landed a steady job at a warehouse, a tough gig, but it paid the bills. The hours were grueling and the pay wasn't great, but it was a lifeline. It gave me enough stability to move out of my car and into a shabby one-bedroom apartment. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it felt like the first step toward reclaiming my independence. Despite everything, I couldn't completely let go of my family. As much as I hated to admit it, I missed them. I missed Sunday dinners with my dad's terrible jokes, my mom's nagging that somehow always made me feel loved, and even Gemma's over-the-top dramatics. So, I kept tabs on them the only way I knew how: social media. I'd scroll through my sister's Instagram, seeing her smiling face as she posted about her perfect life, complete with hashtags like #blessed and #familyfirst. It was like looking into a life I used to have, a life that now felt like a distant memory. Then one day, out of nowhere, I got a message from my dad. It was short, cold, and to the point. "Call me. We need to talk." My heart dropped. I had spent 3 years convincing myself I was over them, but one text from my father, and it all came rushing back. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. When I finally called him, my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. The voice on the other end was strained, almost unrecognizable. My dad, the same man who had kicked me out without a second thought, sounded different. "We made a mistake, Elliot," he said, his voice cracking. "Your sister's ring, it was never stolen. We found it in the garbage disposal." I was speechless. 3 years of being treated like a criminal, of struggling to survive, all because of a misunderstanding? My dad explained that they were doing some kitchen renovations and found the mangled remains of the ring in the disposal unit. Apparently, it had slipped off Gemma's finger while she was cleaning up after one of her dinner parties. "So, that's it? You found the ring, and now everything's supposed to go back to normal?" I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. But inside, I was a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, anger, betrayal, all fighting for dominance. My dad stammered, clearly taken aback by my reaction. "We want to make things right, son. Please come home. We miss you." It was the apology I had been waiting for, but it came 3 years too late. Where was all this concern when I was sleeping in my car? Where was this sudden rush of fatherly love when I was begging for a chance to explain myself? I hung up, not ready to face them yet. It was too much, too soon. But over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. Part of me wanted to run back into their arms, to forgive and forget like the prodigal son. But another part of me, the part that had survived those 3 brutal years, wanted to slam the door in their faces. The thing is, forgiveness isn't easy when the people who hurt you were supposed to be the ones who loved you the most. And I knew that if I did go back, it would be on my terms, not theirs. I wasn't the same Elliot they had kicked out all those years ago. I had scars now, literal and metaphorical, and I wasn't about to let them reopen old wounds. In the end, I agreed to meet them, but not at the family home. I wasn't ready for that. Instead, we decided on a neutral location. A small cafe on the outskirts of town. The place was quiet, almost deserted, which suited me just fine. I wasn't in the mood for an audience. When I walked in, I saw them immediately. My dad looked older, my mom had tears in her eyes, and Gemma, well, she just looked nervous. For a moment, I hesitated, wondering if this was a huge mistake. But then I reminded myself that this was just the beginning of a much-needed reckoning. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and walked over to their table, ready to face the family that had thrown me away like yesterday's trash. I took my time walking over to their table, each step feeling heavier than the last. My family, people I had once loved more than anything, sat there, waiting for me like I was some long-lost relative returning from the dead. The cafe was nearly empty, just a couple of patrons scattered around, absorbed in their own lives. It was the perfect setting for what felt like a scene straight out of a soap opera. As I approached, my dad stood up awkwardly, as if he wasn't sure whether to hug me or keep his distance. My mom's eyes were already glistening with tears, and Gemma, well, she couldn't quite meet my gaze. That stung more than I cared to admit. Elliot, my dad began, his voice shaky. Thank you for coming. We weren't sure if you would. I pulled out a chair and sat down, keeping my expression neutral. Yeah, well, here I am. What do you want to talk about? The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then, my mom broke the silence with a choked sob, covering her mouth with a trembling hand. We're so sorry, honey, she managed to say between gasps. We were wrong. We were so wrong. I wanted to believe her, to let her words wash away the years of pain. But I couldn't. Not yet. It took you 3 years to figure that out? I asked, my tone harsher than I intended. 3 years of being treated like a criminal, and now you expect me to just forgive and forget? Gemma finally looked up, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. Elliot, I don't even know where to start. I was so sure. I thought I saw you near my jewelry box that day, and I jumped to conclusions. I should have listened to you. I should have trusted you. I could feel the old wounds tearing open again, the memories flooding back. Being thrown out of the house, my dad's furious accusations, my mom crying as if I had broken her heart. You destroyed my life, Gemma, I said quietly, leaning forward. All because you couldn't be bothered to look for your damn ring. She winced as if I had slapped her. I know, she whispered. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I turned my gaze to my dad, the man who had once been my hero. And you, Dad? You were supposed to have my back. You didn't even give me a chance to explain. He hung his head, rubbing his temples as if trying to stave off a migraine. I was angry. I let my emotions get the best of me. When Gemma said you stole the ring, I believed her. I thought you were jealous, that you were acting out because of everything. I knew what he was hinting at, the years of tension between Gemma and me. But jealousy? That was a stretch. Sure, we'd had our differences, but I never resented her success. I was content with my own path, even if it didn't involve a fancy job in the big city or a high-profile engagement. So you just assumed the worst of me, I said, my voice hard. And instead of talking to me, instead of listening to your own son, you threw me out like I was nothing. My mom's sobs grew louder, and she reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I wasn't ready for that kind of contact. Not yet. Elliot, she pleaded, please, give us a chance to make things right. We were blinded by our own fears and judgments, but we've missed you every day. Your father and I have been so ashamed of what we did." I sat back, crossing my arms over my chest. "You think a few apologies are going to fix this? You think I can just forget everything I went through? The nights I spent in my car, the humiliation of having to beg my friends for a place to sleep, they all looked down, unable to meet my gaze." Gemma was visibly shaking, her hands clenched in her lap. For a moment, I felt a pang of pity, but I quickly pushed it aside. I had to be strong for my own sake. "We know we can't undo the past," my dad said, his voice barely a whisper. "But we want to try to make amends. We want you back in our lives, son." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "You can't just undo 3 years of hell with a few apologies. I've built a new life for myself. I'm not the same person I was when you kicked me out." "We've changed too," Gemma insisted, leaning forward. "I've been in therapy. I'm trying to be a better person. I know it doesn't excuse what I did, but I need you to know I'm working on it." There was a part of me that wanted to believe her, to believe that people could change. But the scars they left on me ran deep, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to let them heal just yet. "So, what do you want from me?" I asked, my voice tinged with bitterness. "You want me to just come back and pretend like none of this ever happened?" "No," my dad said quickly. "We know it's not that simple. We just want a chance to rebuild our relationship, slowly, on your terms. Whatever it takes." I took a deep breath, staring down at the table. The old Elliot would have jumped at the chance for reconciliation, but I wasn't that person anymore. I had grown tougher, more guarded. I had learned to rely on myself, and the thought of letting them back into my life was terrifying. "All right," I said finally, my voice steady. "But here's how it's going to be. I'm not moving back home. I'm not ready for that. We can meet up occasionally in public places like this and we'll see how it goes. But I need time. I need space." Relief washed over their faces, and for the first time since I walked in, I saw a glimmer of hope in their eyes. "Of course," my mom said, nodding eagerly. "Whatever you need, sweetheart. We just want to be a part of your life again." Gemma wiped away her tears, giving me a small, tentative smile. "Thank you, Elliot. I know we have a long way to go, but I promise I'll do everything I can to make it right." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of me was relieved to finally have the truth out in the open, but another part of me was still wary, still angry. It would take a lot more than apologies to heal the wounds they had left behind. As I stood up to leave, my dad reached out, hesitating. "Would it be all right if we called you? Just to check in?" I paused, considering it. "Yeah," I said after a moment. "But don't expect too much. I'm still figuring things out." And with that, I walked away, leaving them sitting in that cafe, wondering if they'd ever fully regain my trust. As for me, I had a lot of thinking to do. This was just the beginning of a long road to healing, and I wasn't sure where it would lead. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let them hurt me again. The days following that tense cafe meeting were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I thought seeing my family again would bring closure, but instead, it opened up a whole new Pandora's box of feelings. At night, I found myself lying awake, replaying every accusation, every harsh word, every moment of betrayal that had led to that awful day when they threw me out. I wanted to forgive them. I really did. But forgiving someone doesn't mean you forget, and it doesn't erase the pain they caused. I had worked too hard to rebuild my life, and I wasn't about to let anyone, family or not, tear it down again. It was Ryan who suggested therapy. My best friend, the one who'd given me a place to crash when I had nowhere else to go. He knew me better than anyone and saw the toll this family drama was taking on me. "Look, man," he said one evening over beers, "you've been through a lot. Talking to someone might help you sort through all this mess. You deserve to find some peace." At first, I resisted. The idea of spilling my guts to a stranger wasn't exactly appealing. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I needed to deal with this baggage if I ever wanted to truly move on. So, I made an appointment with a therapist named Dr. Harris. She was in her 40s, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that put me at ease. The first few sessions were hard. I didn't know where to start or how to explain the tangled mess of resentment, anger, and sadness that had been festering inside me for years. But she was patient, guiding me through my feelings, helping me unpack the trauma that went far beyond just the incident with the ring. Turns out, the ring was just the tip of the iceberg. The real issue was years of feeling like I was the lesser child, the one who didn't quite measure up to Gemma's accomplishments. Gemma, the golden child who could do no wrong, while I was constantly compared to her and found lacking. Dr. Harris helped me see that my parents' favoritism had left deep scars. I had grown up feeling like I had to fight for every scrap of love and attention, while Gemma got everything handed to her on a silver platter. And when the ring went missing, it was easy for them to believe the worst in me because, in their eyes, I had always been second best. One session, Dr. Harris asked, "Elliot, have you ever considered that your parents' actions were more about their own insecurities and fears than about you?" That question hit me like a punch to the gut. I had spent so long blaming myself, wondering what I had done to deserve their distrust. But maybe it wasn't about me at all. Maybe they were projecting their own fears, their own failures onto me. I started to see my family through a different lens, one that made their actions seem more like the result of their own unresolved issues, rather than a deliberate attempt to hurt me. But understanding doesn't equal forgiveness. And I still wasn't sure if I was ready to let them back into my life. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself slowly healing. The anger I had carried for so long was still there, but it didn't burn quite as hot. I began to focus on my own future, setting goals for myself that had nothing to do with my family's expectations. One of those goals was going back to school. I had always been a good student, but my life had been derailed after getting kicked out. Now, with some savings and a renewed sense of purpose, I decided to apply to a business program at a local university. It felt like a fresh start, a way to reclaim my life on my own terms. My family tried to reach out during this time, mostly through text messages and the occasional voicemail. My mom would leave tearful messages, begging me to come home for dinner, to let them make amends. My dad's messages were shorter, more awkward, but I could tell he was trying in his own way. Gemma sent me a long email one day. It was a heartfelt apology, full of regret and promises to change. She told me about the therapy she had been doing, how she was trying to become a better person, someone who didn't jump to conclusions or let jealousy cloud her judgment. "I know I can never make up for what I did to you," she wrote, "but I hope one day you can find it in your heart to forgive me. You're my brother, and I miss you every day." I stared at that email for a long time, not sure how to respond. Part of me wanted to hit delete, to erase her words like she had erased me from her life. But another part of me, the part that remembered our childhood, the times when we were close, wanted to believe that people could change, that she was sincere. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I wrote back, "Gemma, I appreciate the apology. I'm not ready to forgive you, but I'm willing to try to rebuild some kind of relationship. On my terms." It was a small step, but it felt like a huge leap. For the first time in years, I felt like I was taking control of my own story, instead of letting my family dictate it. Our conversations were cautious at first, like two people walking on thin ice. We talked about neutral things, her job, my plans for school. We avoided the past, the painful memories that still hung between us like a dark cloud. But slowly, tentatively, we began to rebuild a connection. My parents were harder to deal with. Every conversation felt like a negotiation, a balancing act between my need for independence and their desire to pull me back into the family fold. But I held my ground, setting firm boundaries and refusing to let them bulldoze over my progress. I was proud of myself for that. For the first time, I was standing up for what I needed, not what they expected of me. And it felt good, liberating even. As I continued therapy, I realized that forgiveness isn't a one-time thing. It's a process, a journey. And while I wasn't there yet, I was finally moving in the right direction. Dr. Harris told me, forgiveness is about freeing yourself from the past, not letting them off the hook. It's about giving yourself permission to heal. I wasn't sure if I believed her, but I was willing to try, because I was done letting my family's mistakes define me. I was ready to write a new chapter, one that was all my own. Months went by, and the fog of resentment began to lift. Therapy, as tough as it had been, was helping me reclaim parts of myself I hadn't even realized were lost. And, for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I was beginning to picture a future that didn't include living under the shadow of my family's expectations or mistakes. Instead, I was creating a life that was entirely my own. My relationship with Gemma improved gradually. She wasn't the same person who had carelessly accused me of theft and betrayal. It was as if she, too, had gone through her own reckoning. Our conversations grew deeper, and I began to see the sibling I had once cherished, hidden beneath the layers of our shared pain and family dynamics. She still apologized often, too often if you ask me, but it was clear she was trying to make amends in every way she knew how. One evening, she called me, voice hesitant yet hopeful. "Elliot," she started, "I know this may sound like a lot, but would you be open to visiting Mom and Dad together? Just a short visit. Nothing too intense." I was silent, weighing the idea. The wounds were still there, no doubt, but the thought of a more intentional visit, a controlled setting with both my sister and me as a buffer, didn't feel as suffocating as it once might have. "Okay," I replied finally, "but on one condition. It's brief. And I reserve the right to walk out if I feel uncomfortable." "Absolutely," Gemma said quickly, almost relieved. "No pressure. Just thanks for giving it a chance." That visit marked a turning point, albeit a cautious one. My parents were visibly emotional, and my mother seemed almost unrecognizable in her humility, her guilt worn plainly on her face. My dad, a man of few words, stammered through an apology, his discomfort as awkward as it was genuine. The atmosphere was thick with unsaid words, regrets that couldn't be erased, but it wasn't hostile. It was quiet, fragile, as if we were all afraid to shatter the tentative peace. They spoke of how much they regretted their actions, their hasty judgment, and how they had spent countless nights agonizing over what they had done. I listened, letting their words wash over me without offering the forgiveness they clearly hoped for. I wasn't there yet, and they seemed to understand that. In some ways, it felt like a farewell, a release from the anger and resentment that had chained me to the past. I left that day with a surprising lightness in my chest. I realized I didn't need an apology to heal, and I didn't need validation from them to live my life. That encounter was more for them than for me, a chance for them to confront the impact of their choices. I had already begun to find closure on my own, and that, more than anything, felt like a victory. Over the next few weeks, I poured myself into preparations for my future. My acceptance letter to a business program had arrived, and with it, a fresh wave of excitement. For the first time, I was setting goals that had nothing to do with anyone's expectations but my own. I was no longer Elliot, the lesser sibling, or Elliot, the black sheep. I was just me, and that was enough. Ryan was my unwavering support through it all. He had been there at my lowest, offering his couch, his time, and his friendship. When I told him about my plans to pursue higher education and possibly relocate for a job after graduating, he was all smiles. "You're doing it, man. You're making your own path," he said, clinking his glass against mine in a small celebratory toast. "And you deserve every bit of success coming your way." I felt a surge of gratitude for him and the few other friends who had been my chosen family in the absence of my own. They were the people who believed in me, even when my own flesh and blood did not. It made me realize that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who stand by you, who respect you and lift you up. My therapist, Dr. Harris, encouraged me to hold on to that realization, especially in moments of doubt. "You're not defined by what others see in you, Elliot," she reminded me in one of our final sessions. "You're defined by the choices you make and the life you build." It was with that advice echoing in my mind that I finally decided to take the leap and move to a new city. The job offer was a solid one, with growth opportunities and a chance to start fresh in an environment where nobody knew my past. It felt like the final chapter of one life and the opening of another. On my last night in town, Gemma and I had a quiet dinner. She surprised me with a small, meaningful gift, a framed photo of us as kids, taken long before the years of conflict had twisted our bond. We looked so carefree, our smiles wide and genuine. "To new beginnings," she said, lifting her glass. "To moving forward," I replied, clinking mine against hers. When I left for the city, I carried more than just my belongings. I carried a sense of closure, a determination to craft a life that reflected my values, my dreams, and my resilience. I still hadn't forgiven my parents completely, and maybe I never would. But I was done letting their actions define me. As I settled into my new apartment, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The bitterness, the betrayals, and even the reluctant apologies had all brought me to this point. I wasn't the same Elliot who had been cast out, desperate and struggling. I was someone stronger, more self-assured, someone who had learned to stand on his own 2 feet. And as I looked out at the skyline of my new city, I realized that I was finally free. Free from the hurt, the resentment, and the need for approval that had weighed me down for so long. I was ready to live life on my terms, with or without the validation of those who once mattered most. The last thing I did before turning in for the night was send a text to Ryan. "Here's to the first day of the rest of my life." He responded almost instantly, "Proud of you, brother. You've earned this." I put my phone down, a quiet satisfaction settling over me. For the first time, I felt truly at peace, ready to face whatever the future had in store. And as I drifted off to sleep in my new home, I knew that I was no longer defined by the family that had let me down. I was defined by the strength it took to keep going, to rebuild, and to finally let go. The first few weeks in my new city were a whirlwind of activity. I dove headfirst into my new job, eager to prove myself and make the most of this opportunity. The team was welcoming, the work challenging yet rewarding, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of belonging, not out of obligation or shared history, but because I had earned my place. Living alone was a new experience. It was equal parts liberating and daunting. No familiar faces, no old haunts to fall back on. Just me, in a small but cozy apartment, with nothing but my ambitions and a renewed sense of purpose to keep me company. I spent my evenings unpacking, slowly turning the bare walls into a reflection of who I was becoming. Pictures of friends, postcards from places I wanted to visit, and, tucked in a corner, that photo Gemma had given me of us as kids. A bittersweet reminder of where I came from and how far I'd come. Every so often, I'd get texts from my parents. They were tentative at first, filled with awkward attempts at small talk. It was clear they were trying to rebuild the bridges they had so carelessly burned, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to meet them halfway. The pain of their betrayal still lingered, like a wound that had only just begun to heal. I responded politely, but with a distance that I hoped they understood. I needed time, maybe a lot of it, to fully reconcile with the past. One afternoon, as I was organizing my new workspace at home, I got a call from my grandmother. Her voice, warm and steady, was like a balm to my soul. She had been my rock through the chaos, the one person in the family who never doubted me, who stood by me when everyone else turned their backs. "Elliot," she said, her tone gentle yet firm, "I'm so proud of you. Moving to a new city, starting a new life. It's not easy. But I knew you had it in you." "Thanks, Grandma," I replied, feeling a lump in my throat. "I couldn't have done it without your support." We spoke for nearly an hour, catching up on everything from my new job to her latest gardening projects. It was the kind of conversation that reminded me of the good parts of family, the parts one didn't want to lose despite everything. Before we hung up, she gave me one last piece of advice. "Don't be afraid to forgive, Elliot. Not for their sake, but for yours. Holding on to that anger, it can eat away at you. Let it go when you're ready." Her words stayed with me long after the call ended. I knew she was right, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to let go just yet. There was still a part of me that wanted to hold on to that anger, to use it as fuel to push me forward. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to move on without it. As the months passed, I threw myself into work, making a name for myself in my new role. My colleagues were impressed by my drive, and it wasn't long before I was offered a project that required me to lead a small team. It was a challenge, but one that I welcomed with open arms. For the first time, I felt like I was truly in control of my life, steering it in the direction I wanted. Outside of work, I started to explore the city. I made a point to visit a new place every weekend: cafes, parks, hidden bookstores, and art galleries. It was like rediscovering a part of myself I had forgotten, the part that loved to learn, to explore, to experience the world in all its messy, beautiful glory. One day, while wandering through a weekend market, I bumped into someone I never expected to see again: Ryan. He was in town for a conference and had decided to explore the market during his free time. The shock on both our faces quickly turned into laughter, and we ended up spending the day catching up like old times. "I can't believe you actually did it," he said, clapping me on the back. "You've turned your life around, man. I'm really proud of you." "Thanks, Ryan," I said, genuinely touched. "It's been a wild ride, but I think I'm finally getting the hang of it." We stayed in touch after that, meeting up whenever he was in town for work. It felt good to have a friend who knew my past but didn't hold me to it. Someone who saw the person I was becoming, not the one I had been forced to be. Things with Gemma were complicated. She called every now and then, usually to check in and share updates about her own life. She was trying, I could tell, to rebuild our relationship from the ground up. And while I appreciated the effort, there was still a part of me that held back, afraid to fully trust her again. One evening, she called me with some unexpected news. "I've been seeing a therapist," she confessed, her voice shaky but determined. "I realized I have a lot of issues I need to work through, especially about us." Hearing that was like a punch to the gut, in a good way, if that makes sense. It was the first time I'd heard her acknowledge that the rift between us wasn't just my fault. That maybe, just maybe, she had played a part in it too. "Thanks for telling me, Gemma," I said softly. "I'm glad you're working on yourself. I think we both needed this." "Yeah," she agreed, a small, hopeful note in her voice. "Maybe one day we can start fresh, as real siblings, not just whatever we've been." "I'd like that," I replied, and for the first time I meant it. As I hung up, I realized something had shifted. The anger that had been a constant companion for so long was starting to fade, replaced by something softer, something that felt a lot like hope. I wasn't naive enough to think everything would be perfect from here on out. There were still scars, still parts of my past that haunted me in quiet moments. But I was learning to live with them, to let them be a part of my story without letting them define it. A few weeks later, I found myself standing in front of a lecture hall, giving a guest talk about my journey into the business world. It was part of an outreach program my company was sponsoring, aimed at inspiring young adults to pursue their passions. As I spoke, I realized how far I had come, from being kicked out of my family home to standing in front of a room full of eager faces, sharing the lessons I had learned along the way. It was a full-circle moment, one that filled me with a quiet pride I hadn't felt in years. After the lecture, as I was packing up, a student approached me with a shy smile. "Your story really inspired me," she said. "It made me feel like maybe I can turn my life around too." I smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. "You absolutely can," I told her. "The past doesn't have to define you. It's just one chapter in a much bigger story." And as I walked out of that lecture hall, I realized I wasn't just giving advice to her. I was finally, truly, giving it to myself.